My name is Norma Cantú, and I am a professor at Trinity University. I have an endowed chair, the Murchison Professor in the Humanities at Trinity University.
Okay. All right. And can I have like a introduction to where you are from?
I was born in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, and I grew up in Laredo, Texas. And I came to San Antonio in the year 2000. Of course, in between, I went to school. I went to Kingsville, Texas for 2 years in the 70s. And then I went to Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, at the university there for my Ph.D. and came back to Laredo in 1980. And then I've been here pretty much in Texas the rest of the time with a few forays elsewhere. I was in Washington, D.C., 93 to 95. I was in Spain on a Fulbright in 1985. I lived pretty much in Laredo and San Antonio. And then the last, from 2012 to 2016, I was at the University of Missouri in Kansas City to start a Latino studies program there.
Okay. And so you said your background is Laredo, correct?
Yeah,
You're from
that's
the
where I
border.
grew up on the border. Yeah.
Okay. I was actually interested in that. Could you, is there a difference in border regions, like border culture in like, say, I'm from Brownsville, Texas, and the border here is very commercial.
Yeah, the
Uh,
valley is different from the border in Laredo, and both of those are different from the border in Arizona and the border in California. So, yes, I see regional differences. First of all, language differences. Maybe even from Brownsville to Laredo, there's a difference. Now, let me tell you one of the reasons historically, Brownsville, the original town was on the southern bank of the river, Matamoros, and then Brownsville established after 1848. And Laredo, it was the reverse. The old town was on the northern bank of the Rio Grande. And so we had Laredo, Texas. And then after 1848, Nuevo Laredo gets established. So that's one key difference. The other is linguistic. Uh, Breakfast tacos in Laredo are called mariachis. I'm sure that in Brownsville that doesn't mean breakfast tacos, it means musicians, right? So it changes along the border. Another very telling one is the word for kid, like huerco or chaval. In Arizona, they call them bookies. So if you look at keywords in the language repertoire along the border in Spanish and in English, it changes. And that's because of the history of the region.
okay. I've read that you specialize in culture studies, correct?
Right. Yeah, I'm a folklorist.
A folklorist. Okay. And uh, where exactly do you feel that regions have that change? Like where does it come from? Like is it just because they're so far away from each other, or because they just chose to? They settled down there and they developed their own culture.
Well, culture is a funny thing. It's always malleable, it's never static, just like language. And so I really think that it just develops differently according to the people who live there, given the geographical conditions, the political conditions, the social religious conditions. Gloria Anzaldúa writes quite a bit about culture in the valley, as you know. And so that border culture that she's documenting is kind of a generic culture that applies across all different boundaries. It could be France and Spain, it could be Canada and the US. Because whenever you have the two cultures kind of rubbing against each other, there's going to be some kind of accommodation that develops into a third space that has both. And so that's the idea that you have a hybrid culture or a third world, a third culture that develops when two things come together. It's not a new idea, it's been around for a long time. But I think in our contemporary world, it has gained more airtime, if you will, because of the way borders are reshaped in our world, the way people are crossing borders, the deterritorializing of mass numbers of people who move from one region to another. So in all those instances, you're going to have cultural change.
Okay. And do you teach about border cultures in your classes?
Of
What
course.
what what is your current title? I'm sorry.
I,
What is
yeah,
your
I teach,
title?
well, I've taught the literature of the borderlands from, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. I started doing those classes. And I'm a Chicana, so I teach a lot of Chicana literature, feminism, definitely a lot of cultural. The course I'm teaching in this coming spring is an introduction to Chicano culture. I call it Chicano folklore. And I taught for many years. I taught a course at UTSA called The Spanish Roots of Chicano Folklore. And we went to Spain for a few weeks. And we're in a community in Toledo to look at the similarities between the culture there and the culture here.
Okay. I have another question. I noticed you're also an author. So what do you consider yourself more as a teacher or an author?
That's a tricky question.
I
And
I, I know.
very, I used to call myself a teacher who writes because I've always written. But now, pretty much my identity has kind of flipped, and I'm a writer who teaches. And it doesn't mean one is better or not, or the other. It
Hmm.
just means that the identity of a writer it connotes different things than an identity as a teacher. I do both, and I think I do both informed by each other. Because I write, I think my teaching is a certain kind of teaching. And because I'm a teacher, my writing takes on a certain kind of writing. So I think they're intertwined. The same thing can be said about my folklore work and my research as a literary critic, which I'm also claiming as a reader and professor of literature. We don't just read for pleasure, which of course I do, but also because we believe that literature can change the world, that it is a way for achieving social change. And that is true of my writing as well. It's in there. So I really think, although it's easy to put people in boxes, you're a teacher or you're a writer, you really can't cut up a person and put them in boxes because it all happens together. And it's sifted through the one person.
Cool. When did you start writing?
Oh, wow. I was 9 years old, probably. I was always telling stories and writing little poems and things. So when I first published was when I was in high school. And then when I was in college, I didn't have a normal 4 year education. We didn't have a university in Laredo where I lived. So I went to the community college and I was working during the day. I worked at Central Power and Light Company and went to night school until a university, Kingsville, opened a branch in Laredo. And then I was able to finish my undergraduate degree. The only thing you could major in was education or business, and I chose education, uh, high school. So I was teaching, or I got my degree in higher ed or secondary education with an English and political science double major. But although I always thought I was going to be a teacher, when I graduated, I realized I didn't really want to be a seventh grade English teacher. I stood and taught that level, and it was very difficult. My hat off to all the teachers because it really is difficult work, exhausting, frustrating work. And so I went on to get a master's degree. I was writing all along, but I was not publishing. So what I consider my first book, the one that really has made me a writer, was Canícula, Snapshots of a Girlhood in La Frontera. It is about growing up on the border. And I wrote that in 1993 in New Mexico. And I went there the summer of 93 to write another book, but this was the one that came out. And then I came back to Laredo. I was just there for the summer writing and continued working on another book that was eventually Cabañuelas, but it didn't get published right away. In fact, it just got published this last
I was
month.
I was actually gonna,
Yeah.
yeah. Is Cabañuelas your latest book published?
Yes, actually, there's a collection of poetry. That's the latest. That was in September. Cabañuelas was in March. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Wow, two books published in a year. Wow, that's
Yeah,
really.
but they've been around for a long time. The
But I mean,
poem,
they're
yeah,
still published. Like that's
yeah,
more than a lifetime, you know.
it
That's
could
really
be.
good.
Yeah.
I was actually gonna ask you about this book because I started reading the first three chapters. I'm a slow reader, but I was wondering if you could explain to me about the main character.
Mhm. Nena,
Yes.
yeah. Nena is the protagonist of Canícula, Snapshots of a Girlhood en la Frontera. There's a story about her growing up on the border. It's set in Laredo. That first, before you even get to the chapters, it's the Tamalada in Laredo. And so it's a setting, it's kind of grounding it on the border, and it's a continuation from the other earlier book. You don't have to have read the earlier book to get this one, or vice versa, but it helps. So you can get to know Nena a little better. You see her growing up in Canicula as she finds her identity on the border, being both Mexican and Tejana, and how that shapes who she is. All through her childhood, like she'll dress China Poblana, but at the same time, she does square dancing in school. And so there's these two dynamics of being on the border, the US, the Texas identity, and the Mexican identity, and coming together. In Nena, it's a different dynamic because now it's Spain. And so here's a Chicana from Texas and Spain. And it's the same kind of negotiation. She's never fully part of Spain. She's always rooted in Texas, in Laredo. And so there's that kind of give and take about being in an alien element as the epigraph reads. If you look at the epigraphs in the book, there's three of them. And one of them talks about, it's a quote from Mansaldúa about swimming in an alien element. And that's what she's doing. She's in Spain, which is alien to her.
Oh yeah. I always find these books interesting because it's kind of how like the world is against you and the world is just the world. But you have to be in that world and it's a fight just to be you and the world is being it and the world is forcing you to conform to it. So it's
Mhm.
very interesting and I like those sort of struggles and I'm very interested in seeing how she overcomes those
Yeah.
struggles.
Yeah. And especially because then there's a love interest. And so there's the intimation of course, the Spaniards, the conquistadores, and the indigena, and the mestizaje that results from that. So as she goes through doing the research, she's researching fiestas. So she gets to travel throughout Spain, and there's a map in the book that has all the points where she has gone or where she goes to do the research. And in each one, she finds that they have their own identity. They have their customs and their foods and their language. And so it's kind of a reflection of how we too in the US and the Americas also have our culture.
Okay. And is Nana is not is this is a fiction piece, but how much is it related to yourself?
That's a good question. The genre that I have coined is autobioethnography. So it's creative, it's fiction, but it is based on autobiography. I did go to Spain. I had a Fulbright. I did the research. And it's also ethnographic because a lot of the information has to do with me being a folklorist with culture and with ethnography. So it's
So
even the genre is a little different.
interesting. Okay. And could you talk more about your time in Laredo, like growing up in Laredo? Because
Sure.
now I assume it's a lot different than what it was back then.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the poetry book has more of that change and how it used to be and what it is now. when we were there growing up in the 50s, 60s, I would say throughout the second half of the 20th century, it was a very different world up until NAFTA. We had uh, communication back and forth. We traveled back and forth, even as a child. When my parents couldn't go, my brother and I was only 9 or 10, we would cross the river to go buy sugar and meat and certain groceries that my parents believed were better and cheaper in Mexico. And of course, people in Mexico would come to the US to buy things in the grocery stores on the US side because they believed it was better than the ones over there. So it was a booming economy that had people shopping, living, going to church in both sides. The families were not split, they came back and forth. So you could go on Sunday afternoon to a baptism in Nuevo Laredo, and you had gone to Mass that morning in Laredo, Texas. I mean, it just was very fluid. Now, because of the carteles, because of the violence, things have changed. And things are not as fluid. It's not as porous. It's not, and it isn't just the carteles, it's also the militarization of the border, the asking for papers. We didn't have to show any papers. We didn't need a passport. You could just say American citizens and they would let you through. Once in a while, they would ask someone, what were you doing there or where do you live? But it wasn't a big deal all the way through the 70s and 80s even. Like I said, I think it's in the 90s that it starts getting a little more difficult to cross. And also after 9/11, even more so because of the security.
Okay.
And also the border, as other people have said, there's a cultural geographer, Daniela Riola, who says that it is one cultural region. So even though there's a line, we still listen to the accordion on both sides. The music is similar on both sides. Whether it's conjunto or tejano, it's really together and has a similar or an original origin that brings in the music. The language we speak. They code switch in Mexico también. They use the English just like we use Spanish. So there's that very, it's cultural region, the whole area. And I think that has not changed as much. Although now I think it has been a little more very recently. I've noticed, for example, if you listen to the radio station, when I was growing up, it was pretty much all English or all Spanish. And then through the 60s, 70s, 80s, it became Spanglish. And there were many radio stations that were doing both, Tejano stations. Now it's pretty much back to Spanish and English. And I don't know what to attribute it to, except that the communities have been changed because of the violence and because of some of the other things, the political situation. So that the radio station in Laredo, Texas, that used to use all Tejano, very Spanglish, is now doing all Spanish or all English. So I'm noticing that there are some changes. Yes.
Well, so I was just going to ask you how much do you think that violence is a reason for change? And I'm pretty sure you just explained that. Yes, it is.
It's a major cause, yes. And also the violence makes people afraid on both sides and drives people to be fearful of each other. People disappear in Laredo, Texas, and without even having to go to Nuevo Laredo, they just disappear. Where are they? And I'm talking my mom's neighbor, 15-year-old kid who's gone. We don't know where he is. Or my niece's girlfriend who used to teach with her, who used to work with her at a store, goes with her boyfriend to Nuevo Laredo and disappears. Both of them disappeared. Later, they find that they were murdered. So these are everyday kind of things to people that I know and that are connected to me in some way. So it's a very real fear. It's a very real threat to life and to our way of being on the border.
And that didn't happen when you were younger, correct? The disappearances.
None of that was happening when I was a kid at all. I mean, there were violent crimes. The guys would go to the Zona Rosa, where the red zone, the prostitution area. We would hear stories about that when I was in high school, but I never knew about it. And it wasn't the same as it is now. It wasn't the crime, um, the motor that drives a lot of this is the crime, the organized crime that is there.
And there's a demand for from both sides of the borders. Like people don't.
Well, and mostly the U.S. side, I have to say, the demand for the drugs, um, the demand for guns on the southern side, and the demand for drugs on this side. And I don't know that even legalizing marijuana would stop it because it is much deeper than that. And the carteles have pretty much taken over some communities and control what goes on. And when that happens, there's a break in the social fabric.
Okay. And as a writer, how would you come about this? Like, would you talk about this in your work?
I don't do a lot of it for two reasons. I don't want to contribute to the stereotype of the border being a violent place. Although it is violent, it is also very safe. I mean, there's violence in Chicago, there's violence in Boston. It's not just the border. There's crime, there's drugs all over. So I don't want to contribute to that stereotype. And the second reason is I really believe that writing has the power and to make us better people, to make us better human beings, to have a heart. And so if you dwell on the negative, if you dwell on all the darkness, that's what you're promoting. And I don't want to be part of that. So very consciously, I choose not to. There have been a few things in my poems. There are some negative um, depictions of that reality, but I hope that it is a minor. It isn't the overwhelming metaphor or the overwhelming image, so that it is reality, but it is minimal. Yeah. And I think writers do have a responsibility to be the conscience of our community, to be also the chroniclers. What is going on? We are the ones who tell it like it is, if you will. So yeah, there's some of that. Absolutely.
Okay. Do you have any advice for writers? Any other advice?
Yeah, that's a big one, to honor the responsibility to do the work that matters, like Gloria Anzaldúa urged us. One of her, in fact, I think it was published posthumously, it's an essay on 9/11, and she writes there, we must do work that matters, vale la pena. And I think that that's something that all writers should be doing, is work that matters. It matters to us, it matters to our community, it matters to all of us, to the society. And the other thing, read. I know you've heard this before. But to be a good writer, you have to read. I really think we need to uh, expand our horizons, especially on the border, because the tendency is that we become very self-absorbed in what is there and don't see beyond the border. But to see the border everywhere, I think is a revelation. We are not alone. We are at the center, not at the margin. And what is happening on the border, the U.S. Mexican border, is happening elsewhere, and we need to be aware of that. There are borders in Africa. There are borders in Europe. There are borders in South America that similar things are happening. And so, as a writer, we need to be aware. So, read the New York Times. Read all kinds of political, all the blogs you can find on the political situation in the world. Become a citizen of the world. Be aware of what's going on, because anything that happens anywhere affects all of it. So when we write about our border, it's affecting everything. So we need to be aware of that. And I also would say to writers that don't give up. I know a lot of young writers because they don't get published or because they feel, what's the point? They give up. But if you feel like you have to put it in writing, you have to put it in writing. It's your legacy. It's what you need to be doing. So yeah, right.
Okay. All right. And a few more questions. What plans do you have for the future?
You mean as a writer
Yes,
or a folklorist?
a folklorist, yeah.
Well, as a folklorist, I am I start in January. I'm the incoming president of the American Folklore Society, and I've been working with the society to kind of elevate the career as a folklorist, what that means. So young people have that option to be folklorists. I didn't know I could be a folklorist when I was in high school or in college. Uh, and I think that's something that I want to promote. As a writer, I have a novel I'm working on called Champú or Hair Matters. It's spelled CHAMPU, accent on the U, Champú. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. I also have a lot of academic work that I'm working on, essays, short stories, critical anthologies. I'm working on a critical edition of Borderlands La Frontera, the Gloria Anzaldúa work, with another colleague, Ricardo Vivancos. So Ricardo Vivancos and I have edited the Borderlands La Frontera with a critical edition in mind. So we explain what's going on, just like you would Shakespeare play. You create a critical edition. We're doing that with Ansaldúa. And so these are all different projects that I'm involved with.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a lot.
Oh, you have a lot planned. Okay, this is the final question, and this is the hardest question. What is your favorite author?
Ah, I have so many, and every day I have a different answer for that question.
Zach.
I love Cervantes, and I love um, the 19th century novelists, British novelists. I love the Spanish writers. I love Mexican writers, so Juana Inés de la Cruz, all the way to contemporary writers. Fuentes, of course. I mean, so many Latin American poets. It just, I can't give you just one. I can give you a whole bunch. I've been reading a lot of young adult novels recently, and there's some wonderful Latina writers working with young adult and also doing it as poetry. So it's really exciting for me to read The Moon Within. It's a poetic narrative, really beautiful, beautifully written. The Poet X. I don't know if you know these words. They're just fabulous. So I'm very excited about the future of our literature as Chicanas and Latinas in the United States because there are so many young writers doing these wonderful writing beautiful narratives and poetry. So I'm very, very excited about that. And I can't tell you that there's any one favorite, but I would think my favorite kind of literature is poetry. If poetry touches the soul. And I know a lot of people hate poetry, and I think it's because of the teaching that goes on, the way we used to teach poetry. Instead of making it something that is like in many parts of the world, it is part of daily life. It's what you grow up with, reciting poetry. In the United States, we haven't always had that culture. And unfortunately, because it shortchanges people of that experience.
Do you teach poetry?
I do.
Okay, I sort of have a question. Are you the school of thought that this poem means this, and it only means this, or is it can mean anything, and you just have your view on it?
The poetry speaks to the reader or the listener as much as it does to the poet. And I definitely am of the second, the
Uh,
latter. If it speaks to you and it's saying that, then that's what it's saying. And I'll tell you a story. I said it before. when I was in graduate school, I was learning about poetry, and I had a very narrow view of what poetry was. And Lalo Delgado, famous Chicano poet, came to do a lecture in Lincoln, Nebraska, of all places. This is in the late 70s. And Lalo, you may not know his poetry, but it is really very grassroots and, just Chicano. And he was doing his poetry, and I'm sitting in the back with my graduate student kind of hat on, judging it and saying, oh my God, this is not poetry. He's just being political, and, in my head. And then I turn around and there's an old woman and she's crying because of what he's saying. And then I realized, oh, this is poetry. And it's not just any kind of poetry. It is the kind of poetry I want to write that touches people, not just for the textbook, not just for us to say, look at the metaphor and look at the symbolism, but that touches people. That's the kind of poetry I believe in.
That's great. Like that's the love of writing, Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
exactly the love of writing. But
Okay.
thank you.
Sure. Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Bye.